And so when we launched, we're getting hundreds of incidents. And we've since issued 21 reports over the last 2 years documenting the racism. And it has been, and I'll share about that. And because we've been documenting and framing the issue, it has become now a global movement. We've learned a lot about not only the extent and nature of the racism, but how to make racial change. And that's what I'll be sharing about today. Quickly, I'll talk for about 20 minutes and then open up for Q&A. But I want to share some of the lessons we've learned. And I'm calling this approach towards racial justice an Asian American one. It's based on Dr. Doris Chang from NYU. Her Taoist cognitive therapy. She thought that Western talk therapy wasn't appropriate for Asian Americans, or not always appropriate. And so she developed a Taoist approach to doing therapy. And I want to extend that Taoist approach in terms of how we deal with racial trauma to extending it to how we fight for racial justice and make structural institutional change. So my talk is entitled Be Like Water. And we as the Asian and Pacific Islander community, we as a broader American community need to be like water in its clarity, humility, persistence, and restorative nature. The first aspect of water is that it's clear. Lao Tzu said that if we, how can you make muddy water clear? You need to be still and it will clarify. And in the same way, we need to be mindful at the moment to take a pause and really understand the roots of racism, the way water sinks to the roots of things, and be clear on the sources of the racism if we really want to dismantle it or at least uproot it. We need to be clear on how it's impacting our community if we want to address the impacts. We need to be clear on its impacts on ourselves individually if we want to heal from racial trauma. So to give you a sense of clarity, I said we've received 11,000 incidents of hate so far in the last 2 years. I'm going to have Evelyn and Derek read some incidents that we've received at Stop AAPI Hate. And as you listen to these incidents, they're all elders. And you don't think of Asian American elders, immigrants who are limited English speaking, going online and complaining about mistreatment, but they are to us. And they know racism when they experience it. So they just want it to stop. They're not asking for individual redress or hate crimes punishment. They just wanted to share their stories that others can know. And so as you hear these elders' stories, please put yourself in their shoes. And at the end, I'm going to ask you to put in the chat a few of your emotional responses, a few words of feelings that you experience. So we'll start with Derek and then Evelyn, if you could take turns reading these. You don't have to read the parentheses and you'll see, but just take turns reading these incidents. Derek?
Okay. Customer band screaming at me for no reason while in line and correctly distanced at 6 feet. I'm mostly Chinese and my family has been in San Luis Obispo since the 1860s. I'm fourth generation in San Luis Obispo, but I guess I'll never be an American. 71-year-old from San Luis Obispo, California. Waiting across the street, I felt something on my head and it turned out to be spit all over my hair and back of my coat. I was repeatedly spit on by a big white guy, 67-year-old, New York. I was standing in an aisle at a hardware store when suddenly I was struck from behind. Video surveillance verified the incident in which a white male using his bent elbow striking my upper back. Subsequent verbal attacks occurred with "Shut up, you monkey. F you, Chinaman. Go back to China. Bringing that Chinese virus over here." 67-year-old from San Francisco, California.
Evelyn?
On my daily walk in my hometown, Sausalito, wearing a face mask, a white woman yelled at me, "I hate Chinese people. Why do they come to this country?" When she passed me, I was stunned by her words and caused me to fear and be more alert of my surroundings. 71-year-old Sausalito, California. My wife and I were taking a walk, minding our own business, when two dogs tried to attack us. When the woman owner came to us, she said, The reason the dogs are afraid of you is because you eat dogs. Then said, you need to go back from where you came from. We were shocked to hear this. 67-year-old Sammamish, Washington. Waiting to enter pharmacy to get prescription, group of construction workers not doing social distancing made fun of me, faking coughing, spitting, and made slant eyes. No one else called this person out. 68-year-old Oakland, California. Should I continue? I was shopping and child grabbed my arm. Child said I should go back to my country, and I was the reason his father died. Mother came up and put her hand on my arm, but she didn't try to help me. Bakersfield occasionally has ignorant people who make fun of how I talk and look and tell me to go home. But this is scariest and saddest experience I've had in US since about 1977. 70-year-old Bakersfield, California. As I was leaving the restaurant, white male stormed up to me and verbally harassed and terrorized me, screaming, "Return to China, you Asian," and other hateful racial slurs, threatening me physically. A clear case of racial hatred towards me. I gave a verbal account to an officer who arrived later. I have not heard back from anyone. 67-year-old Alamo, California.
Thanks. So if you can put in the chat, just type a few words of your emotional response. I see anger, frustration, angry, ugh, angry, sad, disappointed, anger, shocked, disgusted, shocked, not surprised, disgusted, sad, disappointed, disgusted, helpless, saddened, heartbroken, disappointment, ignorance. So thanks. So, oh, rage, hopelessness, vulnerability. You know, these are the feelings that I think the overall Asian American and Pacific Islander community are experiencing now. What you just shared in the chat are symptoms of racial trauma. Asian Americans across the nation are experiencing anger, anxiety, sadness and depression, hypervigilance where we're watching out for ourselves, avoidance of places. All those are symptoms of racial trauma. This is a period of collective racial trauma because 1 out of 5 Asian Americans have experienced this kind of hate in the last year. That's 4 million cases of hate. And we know it's racial because these strangers aren't attacking us because they know us. It's simply because of how we look that we're getting attacked. So this time of collective racial trauma is akin to Japanese American incarceration. It's not the same situation, but it has the same trauma responses, and it will have the same intergenerational impacts and effects unless we deal with it now. To give you more clarity on what's happening, let me share with you a breakdown of our incidents. We've received 11,000, and they're not all hate crimes. They fall under 4 major categories, the type of racism we're experiencing. Civil rights violations, being mistreated at the workplace, and denial of service constitutes 11% of the cases. Online harassment makes up 9% of the cases, but young people who are on their screens a lot experience this indirect racism a lot more. 70% of our youth say they've seen something stereotypic or offensive, so they're exposed to the racism. Harassment and avoidance are microaggressions making the bulk of our incidents, but they're not micro in their impact. You saw how much racial epithets are used, how much profanity, how often Asians face people yelling at them. Often it's gang bullying when no one comes to help. So these are traumatizing incidents. And a lot of times people just freeze because they're so surprised that their fellow adults would treat them in this way. And finally, the fourth category is physical assault. 1 out of 6 cases are assault, and 8% are being coughed or spat upon. My own wife was running in Oakland and someone blocked her path on the trail and just coughed directly into her face. So the physical assaults are so violent. The anger and the fear directed towards Asians is so palpable. If you read these 11,000 incidents, like I have, because I saw the extent, I wasn't surprised to see elders killed last year. I wasn't shocked by the Atlanta shooting, sadly. We are now preparing for more shootings of Asians, sadly. It's a really difficult time, but we have to be prepared for these situations. The trends have been consistent over the last 2 years. It's clearly racial profiling, although people blame COVID-19 China for COVID-19. Over half of our respondents are non-Chinese, are mostly East Asians, Japanese, Koreans, Vietnamese who report. But a Latino from LA was punched and told to go back to China. And an indigenous person in Vancouver was punched and told to go back to China. So it just depends on how you look. Vulnerable groups are targeted more because bullies attack those whom they think they can bully. Women report twice as much as men, and working class Asians face twice the racism as professional Asians. So maybe Stanford graduates could stay at home and work online, but those who are essential workers who have to be in the interface with the public then face racism a lot more. The impacts have been traumatizing, as I said, and so we have to be clear on this. Those who experience racism have higher rates of depression, stress, and anxiety. And those who experience racism, when asked, what's your greatest fear or stressor during the pandemic, they overwhelmingly say racism. So Asians are more fearful of other Americans and their hate than we are about the pandemic that's killed over 1 million people. Think about that. We're more afraid of other Americans than COVID-19. And that's why we're in a state of anxiety and hypervigilance, because you could mask yourselves against COVID, but you can't protect yourself from some stranger throwing something at you or coughing at you. Because of racism, our Asian American small businesses have been hard hit. People were avoiding Chinese restaurants, Vietnamese nail salons, and so they had to close even before government quarantines. Consequently, they laid off large swaths of Asian American working class service sector. Asian Americans have the second highest rate of unemployment. Look at this stat, 83% of Asian Americans with a high school degree or less had to file for unemployment in California. That's 2.5 times more than the other average Californian with a similar background in education. So we've been hard hit economically too. And I said, we knew that we would face racist violence and racist policies. During the Trump administration, that's exactly what happened. Because of COVID-19, Trump banned Chinese scientists and researchers, and he extended the Muslim ban. He suspended migration visas overall, so that families couldn't reunite. He cut refugee resettlement. He cut H-1B visas for professional workers. All those policies disproportionately hurt Asians. They all saw us as national security threats or public health threats. So we have to be clear, the racism is traumatizing and violent. It's not a case of a few prejudiced individuals, but it's pervasive. It's institutionalized in our society, this racism against Asians. But beyond being clear, we have to be humble. And I really like this quality of water because water doesn't fight through rocks that stand in its way. Water goes with the flow, finds a path of least resistance. It still goes to its ultimate source, but it doesn't fight back. And I think we as Asian Americans also need to learn how to be nonviolent in this moment. It's easy to want to fight back, to arm yourselves, to use mace. But as Asians experience hate, we can become haters as well. As we experience racial trauma, we can traumatize those next to us. hurt people, so that I'm concerned that as Asians experience racism, we too become anti-white, we become anti-Black, we become just like everybody else. And so we have to be humble. I know that as I've experienced the trauma of the pandemic and the racial trauma, I've taken it out on those closest to me, sadly. And so we need humility. We need to approach structural racism by addressing the institutions that socialize racism. Instead of blaming individuals, wanting to punish them with more hate crimes or to vilify them the way we're vilified as others, we need to address the structures that create racism rather than blaming other individuals. That's the humility we need. And let me share with you some of the institutional factors quickly of the racism. People were afraid of COVID, but the political rhetoric really exacerbated the racism. The term Chinese virus really was deadly because it created a racial schema by which people viewed the disease. The term China virus racialized a biological virus and made the virus Chinese. And the term stigmatized the people so that Chinese were seen as the disease carriers. That association that the virus is Chinese and Chinese people have the virus became our implicit bias. It became the way by which people viewed the disease and got triggered by it. Media representations reinforced that association. People saw time and time again Chinese people wearing masks as the representation of COVID-19. So that nexus, that association that the virus is Chinese and Chinese people have the virus again became chemically hardwired in our brains of how to react when we saw Asian people. Even I had that implicit bias. If I saw a Chinese person wearing a mask versus a non-Asian not wearing a mask, I would avoid the Chinese person, even though the non-Asian was probably more contagious. That's the way our brains operate. We get shaped by these institutions to see the world and to react in really automatic ways. This fear of Asians, this triggered response really harkens back to the yellow peril stereotype. This is a notion that Asians are a threat to the West, that we had come from the East with our disease-ridden bodies and overcome the West. And this fear of the Asians has been invoked time and time again by politicians to stir up their base. I'll quickly give you 2 or 3 historical examples of how this yellow peril has been operative. In the 19th century, the diseases of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy were specters of death emanating out of San Francisco Chinatown. This stereotype, along with the threat that Chinese would steal white workers' jobs and the peril that we were heathen, unassimilable pagans, led to the 1882 Exclusion Act of Chinese. At the same time, that Exclusion Act didn't quell violence against Asians, but actually justified it. After its passage, over 200 Chinese settlements along the West Coast were actually forcibly driven out. Just recently, Pacific Grove apologized for the fire that burned down the Chinese village at Point Alonis. That's actually on Stanford University property where the Marine Hopkins station is. Over 200 Chinese were evicted by Stanford University, and when they wouldn't leave, a fire destroyed their entire village. And Stanford then fenced off the area, stationed armed guards so that Chinese couldn't return. My own great-grandparents had lived there at Point Alonis for 4 decades, raised a family, had homes, built a thriving business, but they had to leave Hopkins Marine Station, Point Alonis, and retreat to San Francisco Chinatown as the only place of refuge from racism. History repeated itself in 1900. The bubonic plague was found in San Francisco. So health officials quarantined the area, segregated the area, allowed whites to leave, but kept Chinese in with barbed wire and ropes and, again, armed guards. So the Chronicle headline reads, San Francisco's plague has eerie parallels. A disease comes, Asians get blamed, Asians face violence, and Asians face racist policies. This yellow peril and the connection to racial health policy occurred again on Angel Island. When Europeans arrived from Europe and landed at Ellis Island, they were processed in 2 to 3 hours. Asians, on the other hand, were mass detained, again under armed guards and locked barracks, often for 2 to 3 weeks. Because Chinese were seen as disease carriers, they had to go through severe medical checkups. Because we were seen as illegal aliens, we had to go through lengthy interrogations. 5% of the Chinese who spent their entire family fortunes trying to get to America were deported back for arbitrary health reasons like hookworm. So you could see just from the connection of race, the yellow peril, and health policy, my own family experienced exclusion, mass displacement, segregation, quarantine, mass detention. These policies have all resulted from the yellow peril fear that we're outsiders to America and don't belong here. So we need to be clear on what's happening. We need to be humble because we ourselves are complicit in the system of racism. We're alumni of Stanford that had underexploited Chinese labor. So we need then to be persistent in pursuing racial justice. Even though water is soft and yielding, water is powerful in its persistence. Drop by drop, water can break through rock, and waves from the ocean can actually transform a landscape. So I've really seen how Asians now have created a global movement and have been persistent in making change. So let me tell you a couple of examples of how we are now making change. Our youth are really standing up. We created a youth campaign and 100 youth wrote their own policy report that became the basis of Congresswoman Grace Meng's legislation for ethnic studies. These middle schoolers were persistent and they organized a 1,200 person rally in Berkeley, and they are now advocating for ethnic studies. Our influence are being persistent. When government and mainstream media wasn't paying attention, they sounded the alarm. They were persistent in social messaging. So ultimately, these messages went viral. And now President Biden has issued executive orders, and now mainstream media does pay attention to us. And I think, across the nation and globally, we've been persistent in holding vigils and supporting one another, grieving with one another, hosting rallies to gain support from allies. We've been persistent in helping depressed ethnic enclaves. We've been persistent in chaperoning and taking care of our elders. One elder in Oakland, Chinatown, he's 76 years old. For the last 2 years, he's been persistent in going out with his community group to make sure that the streets are safe for his fellow elderly neighbors. The last quality of water that I want to highlight that I think we as an Asian American community need to be now is its restorative nature. And we just went to Manzanar, my family, a few weeks ago. And you know that this Japanese American concentration camp is based in the desert right next to Death Valley, the hottest place on earth. But while they were there, Japanese Americans used what little water they had to create this amazing garden. They made not just one garden, but there were gardens throughout the camp. They were verdant, lush places of beauty in the midst of desolation. And I think in the same way as Asian Americans experience hate, the danger is that we become hurt people who hurt others. We become hateful ourselves. But the hope is that as Asian Americans instead learn to heal from racial trauma, we healed people can be healers of America, and we actually have this possibility today. We at Stop AAPI Hate are working across race to work on issues that face communities of color and push for racial justice. So we're promoting ethnic studies. This is actually a pretty remarkable movement. Within 1 year, 3 to 4 states will have passed new legislation to require Asian American studies. And about 10 to 12 other states have proposed it already. So it's a large grassroots movement to include Asian American narratives in our curriculum. We're working with other groups, African Americans, Latinos, to support ethnic studies. In California, you heard how street harassment makes the bulk of the racism. we have 3 bills now that are bipartisan to address street harassment. It's sponsored not only by the API Legislative Caucus, but authored by a Black and a Black Latina assemblywoman, one in Southern California and one in Northern California. And we're seeking non-carceral approaches, more restorative justice approaches to dealing with this racism. We've actually secured $156 million from California to combat anti-Asian hate, to provide more funding and provide culturally responsive services to victims, and community safety efforts where neighbors get together, where art groups, where people do art and educate each other. Similarly, Massachusetts and New York have created these equity bills that have now been passed. So Stanford alumni, I invite you to be like water too. Let's be clear on what's happening and mindful that all of us, especially those of us who are 1 or 2 degrees of separation from the racism, understand the impacts of trauma. And if we do, then we need to really be humble to acknowledge it and get healed, or else we're going to just repeat a cycle of violence. Let's be humble and then be persistent in pursuing racial justice that addresses the roots of racism, the structural sources, and then let's be restorative, working with all communities so that we can restore the sense of community that we want in our America. Thanks a lot.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Jeung. I am so impressed with the metaphor. But I would like to open it up to anyone's questions and ask you if you want folks to speak their own questions by opening up their videos and turning on their mics to do that. Would that be okay with you?
Sure, you can either put it in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yep. So I have a question. Do you feel that the second part about being humble and not pushing back and not being violent is culturally very Asian, or is that really a communal response that is irrespective of Asian culture?
I think I want to give, well, I think the way of water, it's not yielding to racism, but it's trying to find alternative paths to fight back and resist the racism is what we need to do. And I know that a lot of people rather like the metaphor of fire, that we've got to burn with anger to challenge the systems. And that's true, especially for young people. But I know that for other parts of our community, the way of water resonates more. We're not all going to be advocates. We're not all going to be activists, but we can, fight back and resist in our own way. And so I think the way of water mostly suggests that it's not that we shouldn't be resisting or fighting back. It's not that we should be yielding to racism, but that we have to find alternative non-violent ways to racism. And that's, for me, the key is to avoid perpetrating and perpetuating cycles of violence that I see happening. And so for me, the way of water is one path that's an alternative to violent resistance, hateful resistance.
Thank you. So we have a couple questions. First one is from Keiko. Keiko, would you be able to ask your own question? I think it's very well stated. She's on her phone. What are some ideas or suggestions for regular folks to get involved in some of these broader community efforts?
All right, thank you, Keiko. That's a great question. As individuals, we could stand up, we could intervene when we see racism, we can vote as individuals, but I really think getting involved with local organizations is so much more of a powerful, effective way. So if individuals ask, how can I as an individual get involved? I would say, work with a group, right? Work with the Stanford Alumni Association to fight for ethnic studies at Stanford. Work with your church to fight for justice in the larger denomination. Work with your local political organization to elect leaders who aren't hateful in their discourse or policies. So for me, Keiko's suggestion to work with local groups is a first key step. And if you don't have a group, then to organize your own. And then secondly, I guess, whatever organization you're in, whether it's an employee group or a faith-based institution, is to figure out alongside other Asian Americans, what are the key issues here that we need to address. I've seen employee groups get funding from their CEOs and making their CEOs make statements in solidarity. I've seen religious groups work together to push their denomination to provide funding for victims. I've seen political groups like us, lobby legislators. So for me, the key is to build an organization, and then whatever site you're in, do you need more ethnic studies? Do you need statements? You can figure out for yourself locally what your community wants to, pursue in its advocacy. If you want to support Stop AAPI Hate's efforts, I suggest going to our website. You can get an email. We'll alert you with legislative alerts when to contact your assembly persons if you're in California. We're going to start working on ethnic studies campaigns. Again, 13 states are now proposing it, and we're going to come alongside those states to get Asian American studies passed.
So Dr. Jeung, you're talking a little bit about policy and supporting policy through education, lobbying, perhaps. One of our participants, Ben, says, it seems that history is repeating itself. Do you believe that the tools to correct current problems are sufficient to quell future issues? What tools are we using?
That's a great question, right? It's like, can we use the master's tools to rebuild the house, right? If the whole system is embedded with institutionalized racism, if racism is embedded in our institutions, can we really reform it? Or are we just making it prettier by getting a couple of 100 million when, we have, that's a great question. And I think for me, the approach is like water, to do both and to have a holistic, comprehensive approach. We need insiders, leaders within the system to make changes within the system, to open doors. And then we need prophets on the outside calling for broader change, more radical change. So I think change is actually best made when you have a Malcolm and a Martin, someone on the inside, someone on the outside, both working for change. And that's, for me, the best approach. For us, we're trying to address structural racism because, again, that impacts the most people. Rather than trying to educate every prejudiced individual one by one, we think we should work with a system so that the system socializes people to be better behaved and more civil. So we are using policy approaches at Stop AAPI Hate. We think they're more long-term. If institutional racism is the problem, then we have to change the institutions that foment that racism. So that's our approach. But I agree, maybe we do need more radical revolutionary change too.
I missed this question earlier. I think it relates to it's a jumping off point from what you just said. Ellen asked, what kinds of restorative justice do you support? How could we use restorative justice in the K-12 school system? Who would you suggest be the facilitator in a school setting? If we're going to unlearn racism, if we're going to use restorative justice, what kinds would you support?
Thanks. So the notion is that sort of punitive justice, when people seek their rights, means someone is wronged, and so we should punish the perpetrator, and then the wronged person gains justice, right? That's sort of the punitive justice approach. I think actually Asians adopt a more restorative justice approach in that, I've seen a lot of elders who've been attacked. They don't want to go to the police. They don't really want their perpetrator to be punished and go to jail. They want them to be educated, right? To learn what they did wrong, to have empathy of how they hurt another individual. That's what I think a lot of elders want. And that's the notion of restorative justice. rather than punishing another, restorative justice restores the relationship. Restorative justice recognizes that someone's been harmed, and to address that harm, we have to repair the harm. And you repair a harm done by promoting empathy, helping the perpetrator understand the impact of what they've done, and then maybe making amends in some way. So that's the notion of restorative justice. It's more healing rather than punitive. It's more educational than like an enforcement model might be. So the question is, how do you do it in the K through 12 system? You see a lot of this like anti-bullying, peer mediation type of efforts where kids learn to be mediators themselves. Kids themselves learn how to address bullying by learning how to talk about their issues, having their friends help mediate between people, helping come up with common solutions that every side is heard. So I don't know, I sort of like, and it's been shown that this restorative justice model where you have peer courts or peer mediation has been effective in reducing suspensions. It's better than a zero tolerance. You got to suspend someone for fighting. But so I suggest that in school settings that we teach students to be peer
Okay.
facilitators of restorative justice.
If we're going to go over there and eat.
I think I just have a question to follow up to, and thank you so much for answering my question about restorative justice. My question, I guess, is very specific, and I don't know if, there are specific answers for this, but basically, if there's racist attacks on Asians in school, and then the principal of that school decides to sweep it under the rug because they want to protect somebody's college application, what can parents do? I don't, I feel kind of helpless.
Yeah, that's a different level, right? That's adult bullying, and that's adult hate. And so I thought you were talking about restorative, like kids bullying other kids kind of thing. On the adult level, then,
Thanks.
yeah, then again, I think the restorative justice model is like, you hope the principal isn't really racist. You try to educate him, you try to work with them individually or her. And then again, but if it gets to a point where, the communication breaks down and you're not getting through to that person, then I think there is an education, the Department of Civil Rights, an Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education. And I would go there. The attorneys I've met from the Department of Education seem pretty proactive. That would then be a civil rights violation that we would have to address. So yeah, I'll stop there. But if you want to contact me more about individual cases, I could direct you to people. Cynthia, I have a song I want to play at the end, but if you give me the opportunity, I'll play it. Bye, Sam.
Dr. John, I have a quick question about social media, because when we are thinking of the current situation against what had happened in the history, what's new is new technological platforms and new channels for communication. So just wondering from your perspective, how does social media play into the whole picture?
Right. That's a great question, Evelyn. And after 9/11, it was sort of a similar situation where Asians get blamed, right? And then they get racially profiled. And we're seen as outside threats. So you think the 9/11 situation and Islamophobia is really similar to what happened with COVID. Outside threat, Asians get blamed, Asians face racist attacks and racist policies. But the difference really is social media. You don't realize, yeah, social media has only been around. Well, for me, I'm older, so it seems pretty new to me. And social media then made it so much easier for hate speech to go viral, right? And the term Chinese virus went viral, and it's clear we could document hate speech virality to hate violence increasing. And then, so you not only get the messaging, but you also get the conspiracy theories, right? We have these algorithms where people are caught in their own social bubbles. They keep on hearing the same ideas. Replacement theory is a big one, that whites are getting displaced by people of color. Anti-critical race thinking, that teaching of race is divisive, it's Marxist, it's teaching about race creates offensive feelings. Social media and the internet then really creates our own social bubbles that polarize us, segregate us, and reinforce more extreme thinking, right? So social media really is totally dangerous, really is a cause of a lot of the racism, and really needs to be addressed. And that's why we want to hold social media company platforms to be accountable to their own community guidelines. We want to make it more transparent about how they develop their algorithms. We want them to, but the whole notion of how these conspiracy theories, these replacement theories get spread and used, it's just, I would love suggestions on how to address it. And even within our own Asian American community, right? We too are shaped, I'm probably shaped by some conspiracy theory, I don't know, because I'm in my own social bubble, right? And so I think, even within our Asian American community, we have certain channels and certain medium that sort of shapes how we think, and how to have better social media literacy, more racial literacy is really necessary. So Evelyn, we're counting on you and your research. Evelyn's doing path-breaking research on that.
Thanks. Yeah, actually learned a lot from Dr. Jeung there. I'm currently working under the Stanford CCSRE, is the Comparative Studies of Race and Ethnicity, working on a fellowship program. It's a research on an AAPI hate and the role of social media and algorithm. Yeah, appreciate any input, suggestions.
I'll jump in. This is Irene speaking. Thank you again for all this work and the presentation. I'm also an academic, so I'm curious if you, and you may not be able to speak to this on this call, so whatever you can say. I just wanted to ask if you need support, or if there's a way, or I'm wondering if your university is supporting that you're doing this work, or if you're doing this all on the side, and so it's all just extra, or how people can support you, or if there's, right, because I think of academics sometimes as being lone rangers, kind of sticking their necks out sometimes, and this is a hot button topic, so there could be peril involved. So I thought I would just throw it out there.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Irene, for the offer of support. So again, I've seen people from all walks of life come out and organize, and some have helped Stop AAPI Hate. We've had data scientists and marketing executives. We have high schoolers build our dashboard, and we had, people, elders really showing me the way of water. So we've really benefited from this grassroots movement. We've had hundreds of youth interns help us. So I'm really grateful for that. But I would appreciate, we need some data scientists to help us analyze our data to, we have cases, or we need another Evelyn to help us do a sentiment analysis of how people, when perpetrators attack us, they use anti-China sentiment. And there's different types of rhetoric that they employ, and there's different levels of anger and fear that they use. And so we need someone to help measure that. So if any of you, Evelyn, we need you to help us do that type of research. And then we need legal research. We need, again, the data scientist research. So we could use all kinds of support. So just feel free to email me, and I'll try to put you to work. Cynthia, I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you. So Dr. Jeung, I have this question, and being in kind of a point of information referral during the pandemic in my role with both Stanford and National Association of Asian American Professionals, I got to the point where people were, I was seeing a lot of Black Lives Matter. No, all lives matter. No, you don't understand, mom and dad. If the house is burning, you go put out the fire in the house, not the entire street. You don't spray the entire street with water. Black lives are hurting. Let's make Black Lives Matter. So my question to you is, I credit you and your organization for putting Stop AAPI Hate on the map. I feel like people use that hashtag Stop AAPI Hate and there is no backlash. How can you not be in support of stopping hate? But have you had any incidences of people saying, no, stop all hate? Why stop AAPI hate? I don't get it. Why shouldn't we stop all hate? Have you experienced any of that? And what would you say to those folks?
We probably get different kinds of attack. People, first, well, I think we're a little less known than Black Lives Matter. So it may be the model minority stereotype. People aren't as threatened by us. And that's why, the Asian American Studies legislation tries to go under the radar to avoid the anti-critical race theory proponents, right? They're afraid if they stand out too much, anti-critical race theorists will attack them. So the Asian American Studies activists are trying to stay low enough so they don't get attacked, but get enough attention that they get their legislation passed. And it seems like they are getting their legislation passed, because who could be against stopping the bullying of kids in the classroom, right? And so the framing is okay, I guess, but we got to be careful not being the model minority, that we're contributing to America so we belong and deserve it as compared to other groups. So I just think we're not prominent enough to threaten other whites. But if you read the rhetoric and why we're getting attacked, it is because they're threatened by the overall notion that they're getting displaced, that China is the existential threat. So we get more hate about being pro-China. So that's where we get attacked. It's not for being anti-white and being a threat to the whites. We're being attacked for being pro-China and complaining about people criticizing China too much, because China bashing leads to the bashing of Asians. So that's where we get attacked. And then we get attacked in a range of ways of being communist or being, mostly being communist is how we get attacked. But the other thing about Black Lives Matter, we are sort of like a little mini Black Lives Matter. In fact, we got a lot of funding, and we have to be really accountable and transparent with the funding. I'm really conscious of that, wanting to have integrity, wanting to use the money well. And then again, leveraging this moment, because we know the attention's going to go away. So we got to make the most of the moment. That's what we're really trying to do, is how do we leverage when the attention's on us to make long-term change? So we got to really seize the moment. That's why the Asian American Studies legislation, they seized the moment and they got passed before critical race theory got big. We got all this money from California while there's a surplus budget. So we got to keep on making inroads now to institutionalize these anti-racist efforts. I'd like to end, Cynthia, if I may, with this song that we had. So some Broadway musicians have supported us too, and they wrote a song for Stop AAPI Hate. We've been having moments of silence because, we've had to, because we've had, sadly, all these deaths. So I needed an anthem to rally us and to provide more hope. So I want to share this song that was written for Stop AAPI Hate to close on a more hopeful note, if I can find it.
Thank you, Dr. Jeung.
Here, I'll just, sorry, I gotta find it.
We've got StopAAPIHate.org in the chat, and Dr. Jeung was kind enough to provide his personal email address at San Francisco State. So if you have the inclination to help with data science or analytics or volunteering, whether it's marketing or otherwise, drop us a line, drop him a line. And here is the music.
Yeah, in 5 seconds, it takes a little while. You heard it, Cynthia?
Yes, I can hear it.
You pray to the heavens,
Oops, sorry.
heavens demand of the sky, beg of the earth crying sigh.
Ah, sorry.
You pray to the heavens, demand of the sky, beg of the earth crying silently. Why do they seek so much blood from a stone? What do you do when you feel so alone? Reach out when you need direction. Reach out, you'll find connection. Reach out through storm and through fear. We are water. We are here. Step in the current and bathe in the stream. Together we rise and together we dream. Join with our families, we are not afraid. For droplet by droplet, an ocean is made. Reach out when you need direction. Reach out, you'll find connection. Reach out through storm and through fear. We are water. We are here. We are water, be as water, flowing water, formless free. We are water, free as water, steady as the endless sea. Steady as the endless sea. Steady as the endless sea. Reach out when you need direction. Reach out, you'll find connection. Reach out through rivers of song. We are water. Reach out, you'll find connection. Reach out through rivers of song. We are water. We are water. We are water.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here, and you've done amazing work. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone. Have a safe and productive week, and we'll see you online soon. Thank you, Dr. Jeung. Bye, everyone.
So Derek, we got to get together. Bye, Derek. Cynthia, yeah, this was, they're all Asians, the singers and the songwriters. They got together for like 2 weekends and just developed an anthem for us.
That's fantastic. It's in the spirit. and the feel of what you were talking about.
Yeah, they got the, I don't even know where they got the water metaphor. I was really surprised when they wrote a song called Be as Water. So.
Have you been giving the presentation as such for a while with that metaphor?
No, I told them I was thinking about it, and then they just took it too, and then I developed mine alongside. So it was sort of parallel, but it worked out really well.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, we thank you for your time. I know it's a very, very busy month for you. I don't even know where you are calling in from, but I thank you from the bottom of my heart for making
Well, thanks for sitting in
SAPAAC
your car for a couple hours.
No, it's has to be done. It depends. I just in so many places all at one time. So not a worry. Thank
Okay.
you. And you're okay with us posting this on SAPAAC?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Okay,
Good night,
bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.